Over the course of its 30-year hegemony, the ANC consistently secured well over 50% of the electorate's votes, enabling it to dominate the governance of the country. However, the 2024 election has marked a shift, compelling the ANC to form a coalition with other parties to maintain at least its leadership role, as it has won a plurality of the vote. The Freedom Charter, adopted in 1955, the ANC's election manifesto of 1994, and the Constitution adopted in 1996, has ostensibly formed the basis of ANC governance exercised over the past 30 years. The ANC's performance relative to the material socio-economic metrics is under discussion here. The people shall govern largely held true initially, with extensive queues and the Independent Electoral Commission managing voting professionally, alongside the smooth inauguration of parliamentarians and executives. However, voter participation has been waning, initially gradually since the turn of the century, and then more swiftly towards the end of this era. The period of ANC hegemony can be divided into two halves, the first under the stewardship of Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, with Motlanthe in an interim caretaker role following Mbeki's ouster and as deputy president subsequently, and the second half under Jacob Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa, who after becoming deputy president, became president following Zuma's ouster. In the first democratic national election of the new South Africa in 1994, some 86% of eligible voters were estimated to have cast their votes. The African National Congress garnered some 12.2 million of the votes, followed by the National Party on 4 million, and the Inkatha Freedom Party obtaining 2 million of the votes. Despite the ANC's overwhelming vote, a government of national unity was formed including the National Party and the Inkatha Freedom Party. The second election in 1999 saw the ANC once again dominating with the majority of the votes cast, with the Democratic Party, Inkatha Freedom Party, New National Party and United Democratic Party being unable to close the gap. It was estimated that approximately 71% of the voting age population had registered, yet the actual voter turnout decreased to 64%, compared to the 86% turnout in 1994. The 2004 election saw the ANC once again winning a comfortable majority, with 69.7% of the electoral vote, the other parties collectively not being able to gain significantly on the ANC party. The percentage of registered voters increased to 72%, but the actual percentage of the voting age population participating declined to 56%, which meant that for the first time, the number of those not voting exceeded those voting for the largest party, the ANC. In the 2009 election, the ANC increased its absolute number of votes to 11.6 million, even though the emergence of COPE, Congress of the People, and the growth of the Democratic Alliance voter base had reduced its majority, percentage and seat-wise. In this election, the registered voter base, 73%, and the percentage of eligible people actually voting, 57%, had increased slightly. The 2014 election delivered similar results for the ANC with 62.1% of the electoral vote, even with the economic freedom fighters having split off from the African National Congress and obtaining 6.4% of the vote. The Democratic Alliance also increased the number of people voting for it significantly, to around 4.1 million people. The proportion of eligible people registering fell slightly to 70%, with those actually voting declining to 52% of the voting age population. In 2019, the ANC vote fell significantly to just over 10 million, representing 57.5% of the vote, while the EFF were able to increase their vote to some 1.9 million, representing 10.8% of the vote, the vote for the DA decreasing to 3.6 million, representing 20.8% of the vote. The proportion of eligible people registering fell to 66%, but those actually voting fell to 43% of the voting age population. The did not vote portion of the population represented some 23 million people, more than twice those who voted for the ANC. The 2024 election represented a true political watershed, with the ANC's vote cratering to below 6.5 million, a share just above 40% of the electoral vote, from a peak of 12.3 million votes in 1994 and just under 70% of the vote in 2004. Despite these losses, the Democratic Alliance also shed over 100,000 votes, with the economic freedom fighters losing over 300,000 voters. The biggest impact, however, was felt from the Umkhonto we Sizwe party led by the ousted and jailed Jacob Zuma, who gained some 2.3 million electoral votes, representing some 14.6% of the vote. The proportion of eligible people registering fell to 64%, but those not voting rose to 62% of the voting age population, or 26.9 million people, or over 4 times those voting for the ANC. The ANC in its manifesto stressed that in committing to improving the quality of life, it meant giving all South Africans the opportunity to share in the country's wealth, to contribute to its development, and to improve their own lives. Over the past 30 years, the South African population has grown from some 40 million to over 62 million, an increase of over 55%. This obviously was the most critical factor in South Africa's development over the last 3 decades. Included in these figures is the net effect of immigration and immigrants who make up some 4% of the population. The gross domestic product of the country had increased over this period of time from 2.4 to 4.6 trillion South African rands, at constant 2015 prices. The GDP per capita rose from 60,000 rands in 1994 and flattened out at a peak of some 80,000 rands per capita, when the economy no longer grew fast enough to compensate for population growth. Ultimately, GDP per capita started to decline over the last decade, owing to the slowing growth rates in this period, reaching 74,000 rands per capita in 2023. GDP per capita is of course a statistical average over the entire population, young and old, rich and poor, working or not, and does not reflect the actual distribution of income across the overall population. From 2006 to 2015, Stats SA had gathered and published data relating to poverty trends, which provided information on which people in the country could be considered poor based on their incomes, including grants, remittances, and wages. The 2 primary categories of those who could be considered poor were those below the upper bound poverty level, defined as adequate to purchase food and non-food items as per a defined schedule, and those below the food poverty level, defined as those unable to purchase sufficient and nutritious food as per a defined schedule. The first 3 surveys had indicated generally declining poverty levels in the first decade of the century, but increasing poverty levels then started to show up in 2015. Stats SA was subsequently not provided funds to conduct any more such surveys. It has, however, continued to publish updates on the poverty lines, which in 2023 stood at 1,558 rands per person for the upper bound poverty level and 760 rands per person for the food poverty level, up some 72% since 2015. There shall be houses, security and comfort forms part and parcel of the notion of sharing of wealth in the country. The type and quality of housing is the strongest indicator of the wealth of the household, and this is further illustrated in the associated levels of income inequality and wealth inequality. Income inequality can be illustrated with reference to incomes at the statistical quartile level. The first quartile corresponds to the food poor level under the Stats SA poverty headcounts for the poorest 25% of the population. These are people who can generally be found living in the rural and peri-urban areas of the country, generally reliant on subsistence, remittances and grants to survive. Their housing is generally inadequate as they tend to live in informal housing ranging from traditional homes in rural settlements to shacks in squatter camps. This quartile has a collective income of 2 to 3% of the total income of the population. The second quartile comprises those living above the food poverty level, but below the upper bound poverty level. These are people generally reliant on government grants and piecework, living on peri-urban serviced plots with communal water and sanitation services, or those in suburban townships with domestic water and sanitation, likely with limited access to electricity. The second quartile has a collective income of about 6% of the total income of the population. The third quartile comprises those generally living above the upper bound poverty level. People in this quartile are considered aspirational middle class, but theirs can be a precarious existence, with many occasionally falling into poverty because of unemployment. These are people generally reliant on wages and income from gig work or small businesses. Generally, these are people living in suburban and urban areas with municipal water, sanitation and electricity services, living in formal housing. The third quartile has a collective income of about 15% of the total income of the population. The fourth quartile represents those at the highest level of income, collectively some 76% of the total income of the population. These are people generally living in urban and suburban settings in formal housing with direct water, sanitation and electricity services. These are people generally reliant on salaries from government, parastatals and corporate institutions, as well as those owning small, medium to large enterprises. The fourth quartile also comprises the 10% with a collective income of about 54% of the total income of the population, and at a more granular level the 1%, with 18% of the total income of the population. Wealth inequality is even more extreme, with those in the bottom two quartiles having accrued negative wealth, with liabilities exceeding assets for the poorest 50% of the population. The third quartile has a positive wealth of some 7%, which leaves the fourth quartile with some 96% of the country's wealth, with the top 10% at 86% and the top 1% at 55%, forming subsets of the quartile. An even more granular breakdown has the 0.1% of the population, 1 in 1,000 at 30%, and the 0.01%, 1 in 10,000, at 15% of the total wealth of the country. There shall be work and security should be the ultimate basis for the economic growth of the country, but the reality over the last 30 years has been anything but. Employment trends have been volatile over the past 30 years. While employment numbers have gradually increased from 8.9 million in 1994 to 16.75 million in 2024, it has not kept pace with actual numbers of old and new job seekers, with unemployment under the official definition having increased in the first few years under the new dispensation, before dropping to 22.3% in 2007, but has been gradually increasing, reaching 32.9% per the latest Stats SA report. If one takes into account those who have been discouraged in seeking work, under the expanded definition the unemployment rate currently sits at 40.2%. Taking a cross-section of employment numbers in 2024, currently it's the youth not in employment, education or training needs who are suffering most, with those in their early 30s suffering unemployment levels 50% and above under the expanded definition. But even older people are suffering from unemployment and underemployment, although not to the same extent as the youth. In the African National Congress 1994 manifesto, the ANC spoke of taking our rightful place in the world. After a good start, the trend has unfortunately reversed direction. Conducting an international comparison using World Bank data, South Africa seemingly was on a good trajectory following some travails in the closing years of the 20th century because of migration and capital flight. In the first decade of the 21st century, South Africa grew at the same rate as the world average, and was seemingly on track to rise above the world average. However, subsequently poor growth and a volatile currency has seen South Africa on track to fall below the average of the emerging middle-income countries. The past 30 years is a tale of two halves, with the pragmatic ANC having done fairly well in the first half, and the ideological ANC having done less well in the second. The reasons for the ANC faltering in the second half will be the subject of the next few videos.